Hey everyone. I just want to say a big thank you to Target for appearing on this podcast and taking the time to open up about topics which are so fresh in his and our memory that I know it couldn't have been easy. But if it wasn't for people like him opening up and telling us, we really wouldn't have first-hand experience or any first-hand knowledge of what was happening in India. And considering just the scale of devastation, death, and misery, this is not a particularly cheerful topic, but I think it's very important. So, there are some times during the podcast where it's a little hard to hear the target, and sometimes it's this microphone, and sometimes it's things in the background. But like I said before, I think this is a pretty important topic because we should know as fellow humans what other humans are experiencing and suffering in India, in other places. So I hope you enjoy. This wasn't an easy topic, particularly for the target, I'm sure, but very informative nonetheless. So enjoy.
Welcome to Safety Last with your host, Stanley Ching.
All right, everyone, welcome back to Safety Last. Today we have a very interesting guest, and I would say the guest that I've looked forward to interviewing the most. Now, granted, I've only done a handful of podcasts, but this one in particular stood out to me because just how interesting the topic was. And I've always had a passion for speaking to people from different backgrounds, different experiences. And today, our guest, the target, is someone from India who, recently went through quite a horrific situation along with the rest of the country and really the whole world with the COVID situation. So, the target, would you like to introduce yourself? Say anything you want to the audience?
Hi, my name is Tathagat. I'm 24 years old and I'm a corporate slave. Nice to meet you.
So as I was doing some research for this, I didn't want to go into this empty-handed, and I was just watching some news clips, reading some news articles about the situation in India recently, and there were a few words that kept popping up over and over again. Some of them included hellish environment. I saw the word apocalyptic a few times, disaster, and I guess what I'm trying to say is I, along with people who are not Indian, would have an outside view of the situation in India. So everything we hear is filtered through the news or through a third person perspective. So what was it actually like to live in India during that COVID surge? Because I feel like just from watching the news that the the spike in cases is actually reduced a little. So can you tell us what it was like living in India during that period of time, and has the situation gotten any better?
I'm not sure where to start, but maybe to give you some perspective, I think almost everybody knows somebody either in their extended family or in their neighborhood or among their circle of friends or maybe among their co-workers, somebody who has basically, you know, died as a result of being infected with and getting sick by the coronavirus. I, I think almost everybody knows somebody who has personally been affected. I don't think there wouldn't be anybody who doesn't know unless they literally live somewhere in the Himalayas, far away. I know.
Mm. And do you feel, just to clarify, did you say that everyone in India knows someone who has died or someone who has gotten sick with COVID?
I would say everybody knows somebody who has died.
Wow, that's, to be honest, like, uh, part of the reason I was so interested in this interview is because I feel like Australia has been somewhat sheltered from coronavirus. We're pretty lucky in the sense that this is an island country, so we're surrounded by water, which makes traveling here difficult or harder. And obviously, just the size of the population density also helps. And we've only recently experienced the Delta variant, which is the variant that just tore through India. And we've only just started to, like shut down, lock down, and only in the past 2 weeks have I really experienced it. So when you say things like every Indian has basically experienced death in their family to some extent, it's pretty what's the word? It's pretty eye opening, and I do consider myself pretty lucky to be sheltered from it. So, just some follow up questions like, what is the mood like? What was the mood like in India? Uh, I guess what were people saying? Was there just a lot of anger and confusion at the government or at other people or at the medical service? Like, what was it like? I guess the main question is, what was it like living in India during that period?
I guess it was a bit of all of those, and to some extent, it's actually continuing.
Hmm.
So, uh, at the government, people are angry because it could have been avoided, and you know, the government, the current ruling party, they continue to, go on with the rallies, like political campaigns and such, gathering large masses of crowds while the virus was spreading.
Hmm.
People are angry at the medical facilities because of their neglect, because of many hospitals, many private hospitals using this opportunity to try to rob people.
Really?
And
See, that's something I haven't heard about. Could we just sorry to interrupt? Could we just clarify when you say the government? I know it's Modi in charge, but what's the name of his political party, and why do you think he kept the rallies going? Like, why did other political parties stop their rallies?
okay, so the name of his party is BJP, and it wouldn't be accurate to say that other political parties stopped their rallies entirely, but it's more like you know only BJP had the sufficient funds and the capability to conduct them at a large scale and continue them despite all the restrictions and such.
Hmm.
And even then, a lot of people are still defending Modi, and a lot of people are criticizing him. A lot of people are saying that he has done his best, but the medical facilities, there are all kinds of opinions actually. But basically, the opinion by and large, I think, is that it could have been avoided. But there's also another aspect of the media. The mainstream media in India isn't accurately reporting on the deaths. Some people suspect, and it's also partly because of how the government is controlling. So, majority of Indian population is Hindu, right?
Hmm.
So in Hinduism, we basically cremate the dead.
Hmm.
So if you consider the number of deaths the government is reporting for coronavirus and such, and if you consider how many bodies are being cremated every day versus how many bodies were being cremated, say last year or 2 years ago, there you really start to see some discrepancies.
Hmm.
So basically, during the peak period, uh, there were cremation grounds which were so full that they had to, start cremating in nearby parks and even a block of roads to have some space to create funeral pyres. So, based on that, the numbers do seem very sketchy, actually.
Mm. Just to elaborate on that, so the numbers you're talking about, and I have them in front of me. So at the peak period, which was, let's see, around the May period, That seemed like the peak period from these statistics. It was reported to have around just under 5,000 people die a day in India. And you're saying, according to just popular opinion, that people think that's too little?
Yes, that is so. Because generally in cremation grounds, they reported that something like 10 to 20 bodies at most used to come on normal days in the previous years. But now
Mm-hmm.
there were, 100 or 150 dead bodies or something. And this for most of the, cremation grounds. So there are like maybe five or six cremation grounds in a city, and then there are so many cities. So we don't really know what was the number of death certificates issued or such because that data is not publicly made available. But the popular opinion does doubt that those numbers are very little.
As I said before this interview, I just wanted to do some research because there is that distance that I have to this event. And this video that I watched from this person, he was in charge of cremation. I forgot his name, but he was in charge of cremation, and he said, and he actually repeated things that you just said, which was on a normal day, 2 years, 3 years ago, he would get around 10 bodies a day. Now that's jumped to 90 bodies a day, or sometimes 100 bodies a day, and it was actually a really touching video. And one thing that stands out all the time from every video, everything I've watched, everything I've read about India during this period of time was just how tired people looked. This person who worked at the cremation said he would work 22 hours a day, or he would sleep for an hour or 2 hours a day at max. And I guess what was really touching was, as you said, in Hinduism, you have to cremate the body. And his foundation said uh, during this period of time, because of the economic stresses on people, like people are not really working. I'm sure there's just so much pressure. He said all funerals will be free of charge, and we provide wood free of charge. So I guess I just want to I want your opinion on that, that story I just said, and then I want you to talk about a little more about Modi. So, do you think this has rocked the government, or sorry, the people's trust in Modi?
I think to some extent it has, because a lot of people, like, the thing with Modi is that not only does he have excessive amounts of power to censor the media and such, but he also has a large following of very loyal fans.
Hmm.
But since everybody is affected to some extent, I would say somewhat the following would have been affected. Although it's hard to
Hmm.
say how much exactly because it's still unfolding. But virus does not necessarily differentiate whether you're a Modi fan or you're against Modi or such.
Hmm.
If you're infected, right?
Hmm.
So yes, it has changed his opinion a bit.
And just to make sure, most of Modi's supporters, they're more right wing Hindu nationalist. Is that correct? And is that one of the reasons he kept the rallies and religious festivals open, because he didn't want to affect or impact his base?
I think that is the case. However, I would like to point not for the sake of censorship, but it's not the government is entirely to blame. To some extent, the blame also lies with the people,
Hmm.
because this period was a so-called second wave of the virus,
Hmm.
and as soon as it ended, so basically hospital beds were full and healthcare facilities were overwhelmed and so and so. But as soon as restrictions were lifted, people flocked to tourist destinations in the hills,
Really,
and
that's interesting.
and from hospitals being overbooked, we went from that situation to hotels being overbooked instead. and this was just a few weeks ago.
Really? So, are you saying that a few weeks ago the lockdown was removed and people instantly started going out? Like that seems strange because to me, if India was hit that hard from all the news articles that I've read, all the news sources I've read, that like if India was truly hit that hard, that they would immediately go and a party or go traveling as soon as the regulations were lifted. Like that seems a little strange to me.
Actually, I think the people probably think like if they don't go now, they won't be able to go maybe for another 6 months or so because
Hmm.
the third wave would come in. But what they don't realize is that they are a part of the third wave.
Hmm. And is COVID more concentrated in the north of India or in the south India? I guess it would make sense that it's most concentrated around the urban areas, but is there a part of India that is especially affected? And has it also flowed into neighboring countries? So whether it's Bangladesh or even Sri Lanka or Pakistan, like has COVID rippled outwards?
Yes, I would say it has rippled outwards. As for whether it is concentrated in the north or south, uh, I think a binary answer to it would be a bit biased. But the thing is, it has affected people, it has affected regions on the basis of population density, I would say. Regions which were, you know, which had more people basically affected more, and, people regions which were sparsely populated were affected less.
Hmm.
However, as far as the spread goes, I would say that some states in the south have actually handled it better, uh,
Hmm.
especially Kerala, because
And why do you think so?
uh, because there was an interview with the chief minister of the state, and
Hmm.
even he was pointing to the discrepancy number of bodies burning in the funeral pyres versus the number of deaths reported. So
Hmm.
I think in India it's actually rare for a government official to admit to such discrepancy. So the fact that he pointed it out suggests that they actually are working towards it. And
Mm-hmm.
also in terms of the relief government provides, it's not entirely on the center. It's also on a state by state basis.
Okay.
So and also the type of reporting they do, how basically how honest they are.
Hmm.
In parts of UP and Bihar, which happen to be the two most densely populated states,
Can you tell the audience where in India these two states are?
they're in the north actually, and
Hmm.
around the northwest parts.
Hmm.
Basically, the rivers Ganga and Yamuna flow through these states.
Hmm.
UP UP mostly has the calmer part of the river, and Bihar and Bengal, I would say they have the flood basins.
Hmm.
So locally the river in Bihar is called the Sorrow of so and so region.
Hmm.
So basically, they are very densely populated regions, and there were instances where people, somebody died in somebody's family. So rather than give them a proper funeral because they couldn't afford it, they simply buried them somewhere. And
Hmm.
when it rained, basically the soil wore off and the dead bodies were exposed.
Oh my god. Oh, you know that reminds me of this story that I once read. Uh, it's not exactly the same, but it does remind me of it. Apparently, in Madagascar a few years ago, the Black Death came back, and part of the reason it came back was uh, this is just what I read, so it might be a little exaggerated, but people were burying their dead, and then there was this ritual or there was this tradition where they would dig up the dead and then dance with them. Apparently, now I know the Indians weren't doing this, but because they were exposed to dead bodies afterwards, they caught the Black Plague again, and there was a period of time when the Black Plague was killing dozens of people in Madagascar a day. Could I ask a question about bodies being exposed in India? Now, I'm not sure how much of this is exaggeration. So the Ganges, I hope I'm saying that correct. Am I saying that correct?
Um, the what?
The okay, so that means I'm clearly not saying it. The Ganges River.
Okay.
How do you say it?
All right. Uh, I guess that's how you say it as a native English speaker, but we use the term Ganga, or
Ganga. Mhm.
or maybe in Indian English we say Ganges.
Ganges. Oh, Ganges. Okay, well, I'll say Ganga. So with that river, I'm not sure if this was exaggerated in order to maybe besmirch the Indian name, but I don't really know. But I was hearing cases where, because this river is so important, bodies were dead bodies were being dumped or thrown in there, because I'm pretty sure the dead is supposed to be, or the cremation ashes are supposed to be put there, and then what would happen was these bodies would wash into other villages or other cities and infect other people. So, uh, did you hear about this story? And if you did, or if you didn't, how truthful do you think this is?
Okay, so I have not heard about this story, but I think there might be some truth to it.
Mm,
However, I don't think it would necessarily be about the coronavirus, since it cannot catch it from a dead body.
mm,
Uh, but there are a lot of cremations which do happen on the river Ganga.
mm-hmm,
Basically, there are certain holy sites which are situated along it, certain cities,
mm-hmm,
and there are people who specifically go to die in those cities
mm.
because it is considered very holy. And
Okay.
sometimes when people die, the funeral pyre is made such that it floats while burning, so the burning dead body it sinks into the river. Because it has been happening at such a mass scale, there are a lot of concerns with pollution and such.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read that there are certain turtles actually which feed on the half burnt flesh of people,
Wait, so can you say that again? There are certain what, sorry? Who feed on the flesh?
like turtles.
Turtles. Okay, I've actually read that too as well.
And I think it's not unlikely that the bodies would float off in the nearby villages or such.
Mm. One of the big things that was repeated, as I said before, throughout my research, was just the lack of oxygen. Can you elaborate on that? Um, was there a shortage of oxygen? And if there was, like, was it the government's fault for not providing more? Was it the medical institution's fault? And there's something that you said before, which I actually just forgot about it until just then. You said a lot of people were not only angry at the government, but at the medical institutions, at the hospitals, and maybe even doctors at ripping people off during this period of time. So, this is really two questions put in one, which is the oxygen situation. Was it really hard to get oxygen, and why was it so hard? And secondly, can you elaborate a little more on how doctors were trying to rip off other people, or hospitals were trying to rip off other people?
Right. So, India basically does not have healthcare, you know, universal healthcare for its people,
Mm-hmm.
and India basically became a capitalistic country only about some 30 or so years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, what happened is India picked up not only some of the good parts of capitalism, but also some of the bad parts of capitalism. So, there are some places. where you shouldn't handle everything as a business. Healthcare happens to be one of them. Unfortunately, that is not the case in India. So there are a lot of private hospitals here which actually can take whatever fees they want or whatever fees you know the patients are willing to pay, and rather than treating them as patients, they are more like customers or a source of income for the hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
So in India, there are government hospitals and there are private hospitals. At government hospitals, treatment happens at a very low cost or even free of charge.
Mm-hmm.
But at private hospitals, it's like the US.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you and your descendants will continue to pay the bills if you accidentally get sick, or if the hospitals decide that it's more profitable to keep you sick or keep you hospitalized.
So wait. So you just said that in the US, hospitals might keep you sick if it's more profitable. Like I agree with the profitable part, but are you saying that during the COVID situation, some hospitals were keeping their patients sick or within the hospital in order to charge them more money?
To give an example, you know how coronavirus is treated. There are various types of treatments. One of them is plasma therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So plasma therapy was disapproved by you know many official bodies of many other countries some 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, Now it would
Do you
be
know? But
maybe
by the way, do you know what plasma therapy involves? So I'm not science trained, and I'm sure some people in the audience would like to know. Do you actually know what that entails?
right. So basically, you have a sick patient and you have a donor who has a matching blood type,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea is that the donor would be somebody who has already recovered from the virus.
Mm-hmm.
And if you basically take out plasma from their body, blood plasma,
Mm-hmm.
and transfuse it to the
Mm-hmm.
patient would, you know, gradually develop antibodies of their own, and that would help them against the virus.
Got it. Got it.
So that's the theory. But the thing is, this was disapproved by many other, institutions and bodies of doctors in the UK and elsewhere some 7 to 8 months ago,
Mm-hmm.
that plasma therapy is not necessarily effective, and on the contrary, plasma therapy can even be dangerous because it can promote the mutation of even more deadlier variants of the virus.
Interesting.
But even then, a lot of hospitals continue recommending plasma therapy, and then there were instances where a lot of unnecessary tests were performed, or patients were overcharged with things they didn't actually pay for. There were cases where people were apparently hooked onto a ventilator, but it turned out that the ventilator was not even switched on, or it was not even plugged in, or there was basically nothing attached to the ventilator, such as an oxygen tank or something.
Mm.
It was only for the show.
And was that for placebo, which is to make the victim, not the victim, the sick person feel like they are getting treatment and hope that their mind tricks them into getting better, or was that just so that they could charge them more money?
I think it's the latter because, as far as I know, placebo doctors and hospitals actually conduct placebo to test the effectiveness of medicines. So,
Mm-hmm.
say for example, there's patient A and patient B. Patient B is receiving the actual treatment. Patient A is receiving something like sugar pills.
Mm-hmm.
So, you want to test how effective the recovery of patient B is compared to patient A. Patient A won't necessarily know that they are receiving the placebo treatment, but it's for the study.
Mm-hmm.
I
Got it.
don't think it was necessarily for placebo. I think it was more like they were trying to rip people off. Then there's instances where the dead body is wrapped and given to the people. So the
Mm-hmm.
hospital staff, they were basically telling them not to check it at the hospital, and when they went to the cremation grounds to unwrap the dead body, they found that it was not their family member but some stranger instead.
Wow. Oh my goodness. And do you think this has resulted in a huge loss of trust in the medical profession? And if the answer is yes, which I assume, maybe I'm wrong. If the answer is yes, what do you think? What do you think are the consequences of this? What are the repercussions of this distrust with the medical profession, which is really one of the pillars of society?
I would say there isn't any one answer to this, and whatever answers do exist, maybe most of them are unpleasant. So one kind of repercussion, one kind of reaction to the situation has been that you know in India we also have some alternate systems of medicines, including some traditional medicine and such.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there have been practitioners of it is not to disapprove the traditional medicine systems. They do work effectively for a lot of diseases, but certain practitioners of or certain promoters of such systems, they started spreading the false claim that certain medicine which they developed is more effective in curing the virus. It's effective against preventing the virus and such,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they basically use this opportunity to try to rip people off
Mm.
or to discredit doctors. On the other hand, a lot of hospitals and such were exposed, but in India, there's another issue we have, which is that if there is a big and powerful organization, if you expose them, they can actually sue you for, you know, what is it called? Basically,
Defamation.
yes, defamation.
Hmm.
And in most cases, the person who is suing them, if they are an individual or if they don't have enough funds to basically continue pressing the case, they usually drop the charges.
Mm, got it. And I'm not sure if India has, if this has happened in India, but do you think this distrust in medical practices, or maybe just the fear and shock of something like COVID just tearing through the country, do you think this will lead to more anti-vaxxers in India?
It's actually hard to say. If you look at the data for how many people have been vaccinated or what percentage of the population is vaccinated,
Hmm.
it actually happens to be the lowest for the two most populated states and actually very high for the smaller, less populated states, like the states with less population or
Hmm.
even states which are less densely populated.
Hmm.
And I think to some extent there is also a factor of religion, as in certain religious leaders basically claim that certain extremist religious leaders, I would say, they claim that vaccines are against their religion or basically the way they are produced is against the religion or such. Then there
Hmm.
are conspiracy theories as to whether vaccines are, you know, the typical anti-vaxxer theories that the government is putting something in the vaccines or such.
Microchips.
I don't think a lot of people actually believe in microchips, but there's a general mistrust
Yep.
because even after taking the vaccine, a lot of people, including doctors, have died because of the virus. And
Hmm.
although those happen to be a small percentage of the cases, because such cases are highlighted a lot in the media, people tend to be hesitant or distrustful of getting the
Hmm.
vaccine.
Hmm. This actually reminds me of this video that I watched previously, which talked about how do you get communities which have their own form of medicine to get vaccinated. And the person speaking, she wasn't actually Chinese, but she used China as an example. And I'm sure you know what acupuncture is, which is just the injection of like a tiny needle into the body, and then it's supposed to. I'm not really that familiar with the I guess the specifics. I've actually had it done to me before, but the idea is you poke certain pressure points, and then your body is supposed to react positively. And that idea, that concept, which has been in Chinese medicine for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that idea was used to spread vaccines. They actually use this idea of what we are going to, inject or poke you with the needle, and then certain things will happen, certain positive things will happen, just like acupuncture. And that was actually one way to get the idea of vaccinations and needles into the Chinese community.
That's kind of smart, but I don't think it was always work because it also depends on the population.
Hmm.
In case of India, I would say it may not necessarily work to the same extent because India is not a single uniform culture. There are
Hmm.
various religions, even within the religions, there are various sects. Even the followers of all these various sects and religions, they may belong to different type of ethnicities or certain communities or such. So I guess that's a big challenge. However, speaking of vaccines, India actually happens to be one of the leading exporters of vaccines in the world. I think something like one third of all the world's vaccines are manufactured in India. However, even
Wow.
despite that, India has a shortage of vaccines.
And is that because the companies keep selling it to high bidders? And if that is the case, why hasn't the government jumped in?
It's a bit of mixed thing actually. It's like before there was a crisis in India, India actually promised to various neighboring countries and such that they will be given a certain amount of vaccines.
Hmm.
So when the vaccines were actually ready, that was also the time when second wave hit.
Hmm.
So for legal reasons, a lot of the companies or a lot of contractors couldn't actually, you know, break their promises of
Yep.
giving the vaccines.
Hmm.
And even then, in some cases, the government did step in and stop the export of vaccines.
Hmm.
But uh, I don't think it would be 100% possible to contain it because they basically did not expect it to happen. They thought that I think it was more like the first wave is gone, and now maybe they can sit back and have rallies, have religious festivals, and everything would be all right. I think it was more like they were under that kind of impression.
Mm. Um, One of the videos I watched was from an Indian person who was living in Britain, I think. And something he said, which stuck out to me, was there was a period of time at the beginning of this year when India was quite confident or quite, I guess, proud, because other countries, other European countries, the United States, wealthier countries, were struggling with COVID in a way which India was not. And there was a sense of pride that India was producing so many vaccines. They were making deals with his neighbors, saying, we'll provide some vaccines. And then there was almost a sense of despair when the opposite happened. So I guess my question is, was there a sense of pride at the beginning of this year that India was actually doing relatively well?
I would say yes, there certainly was a sense of pride. Maybe the people were overconfident, and I think it did come quite as a shock to many people or many institutions, in fact, when the opposite happened.
Mm-hmm.
And to the vaccines point, I think another thing to consider is that although India does produce one third of the world's vaccines, a lot of these vaccines are not actually patented by or entirely controlled by Indian companies, but it's rather like foreign investors outsource the production to India. So even if the vaccines are produced here, what many people don't realize is that doesn't mean that we have complete control over you know who is using the vaccines or to what extent can we leverage that to help our own country.
Mm. Um, but how much do you think the second and first wave impacted India's relationship with China and the growing tension between the border? I think it's called Ladakh, from memory. How important do you think this virus was in raising the tension?
I would say probably a lot. So as far as the public sentiment goes, you know, most Indians actually happen to be very, very patriotic. There was also the issue of conflict in Ladakh, and then around the same time, pandemic like the coronavirus was spreading, and I think a lot of people do believe that China is responsible, or that it may in fact even have been planned by China to actually
Mm-hmm.
set back, you know, progress of other countries and such. However, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is that uh, there, I think around May or so, there was some issue with transportation. China had actually banned some flights going to and from India and China, which actually led to a slowdown in the vaccine production process because a lot of materials required could not be delivered on time. And also, there are a few vaccines now, but India, despite its close proximity to China, doesn't actually, recognize or is not actually using the, Chinese patented vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is, I believe it's called
Sino,
Sinopharma. Sinopharma.
Sinovac or something, I
Uh
think.
huh. Talking about the Chinese vaccine, has there been any discussions if it's effective or not? Like, or is the reason that India is not using it because of the tension in Ladakh and the um, growing distrust of the Chinese government?
I think it's more like the growing distrust of the Chinese government, and the situation in Ladakh only happens to be one of those many points of distrust. And maybe
Mm.
another case would be that in turn, the Chinese government also distrusts India and maybe to some extent does not allow for certain things to happen.
When you say allow for certain things to happen, are you saying like doesn't allow Indians to buy the Chinese vaccine or makes it harder for Indian companies to get it? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, that's what I mean
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me some of the restrictions that were put on you during the during April and May, which was the most extreme periods? Um, for example, in Australia or in Sydney, really, I can only talk about Sydney. We are there have been restrictions such as we have to wear face masks when we go outside. Uh, it was recently put in that any employer that makes you go to work when work can be done online can be fined. So, what were some restrictions that you had to deal with during that period of time?
We did have to wear face masks. As for employers, I think during the first wave itself, whatever companies which could, switch to work from home did switch. Other than that, a lot of companies were actually calling their employees to work. That was during the first wave. However, I think during the second wave, most of the companies switched back to the work from home thing. But I think even if they actually wanted to call their employees, they couldn't because you needed certain permissions, you needed to be in certain, you know, uh, certain categories of professions where actually going out was essential.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually had something sort of like a curfew where we could only go out within a certain period of time, like a certain time since morning till evening.
Mm-hmm.
And during that period, the you know all the shops selling non-essential goods such as electronics or clothing or such, they were closed,
Mm-hmm.
and only grocery stores and uh, that's it. Like only certain businesses were open which were considered essential, but that too they were only open only for certain hours of the day.
Mm-hmm. So when were these hours of the day, and was there any support, any financial, any government support given to businesses which were required to shut down?
So when exactly were these hours? To be honest, I don't really remember. I think it was something like um, maybe something like from 9 to 7, or maybe 8 to 7 or something.
And what happens if you get caught outside?
If you're on your own or if you're with one other person and if you're wearing face mask, then it's fine. Other than that, if there are three or more people, or if you're not wearing face mask, basically the police can arrest you and you'll be fined for it.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how much that fine was?
I don't know what is the official fine, and in India it so happens that rather than pay fines, it's more like people pay bribes because paying the bribe would be easier, and uh, basically they won't have to register the fine or such. So
Mm. Yeah, this that actually reminds me of this story from one of my Filipino friends. A few years ago, he went back to the Philippines, and um, what's the story? For some reason, he couldn't. His uncle couldn't drive the car. Now, I'm not really sure what that reason was. Maybe it was his license was overdue, or maybe like you could only drive the car on a certain day because of some regulation. I'm not 100% sure. But he told me that when he got pulled up by the police, the uncle simply reached into his wallet, pulled out $100 bill or some amount of money, and just said, "Okay, here you go." And the police said, "All right, have a good day," and drove away. So, were situations like that common in India?
it does happen a lot, but uh, if they think that they can probably get more money, or maybe if they're in a bad mood and if they would like to, I don't know, maybe bother you a bit, then bribe cannot help you. But it does happen a lot.
Well, I guess my ending question is, what happens from here? What do you think will happen? What do you think people's spirits are? How enthusiastic are people for the rest of this year? And you mentioned before there was this fear of the third wave, and if it does come, what do you think will happen? Do you think India will be better prepared? Do you think people in hospitals be better prepared? I guess I just want you to predict, and I know it's never easy to do so, but predict into the future how India will react or maybe recover for the rest of this year.
To be
I know it's
honest,
not easy.
personally, I don't think there would be that much of a difference. It's more like people probably have gotten used to this kind of environment by now. Maybe
Mhm.
the third wave won't be as intense. Or maybe it might be equally as intense, but maybe people will not care as much. It's actually hard to say. As for government, uh, the government is trying hard to, retain their image in very questionable, by using very questionable methods, I would say. For example, if you get vaccinated, on your certificate, there is a photograph of Modi on it.
Really? Wow, I
Yes,
did not know that.
yes. So if you get vaccinated, you get a certificate with a photograph of Modi, and you need that certificate to, basically travel or apply for visa or such wherever it is allowed.
Wow.
And there has been a lot of backlash for it, but
Mhm.
it so happens that majority of India's population is still not, you know, very well educated. They're easily swayed by things like this.
Mhm.
So, to be honest, it's actually very hard to say what would happen because unlike China, Indian people's sentiments they are not entirely controlled by the government. Unlike the West, uh, people are not. They don't have good understanding of their election process or such,
Mhm.
or how the system works. So if something good happens, even if the government was not entirely to be responsible for it, they would take the credit, and most people would actually believe it. If
Mhm.
something bad were to happen, if the government were responsible for it, they they can easily make somebody else the scapegoat, and people might believe it. It's actually very hard to say. In some
And
cases,
do you think the Modi government or the government in general has made other parties the scapegoat for the second wave?
actually, that has been happening ever since they came into power. So,
And who's the scapegoat?
yes, scapegoating, I think it has more or less become the norm. However, I think with the vaccine rollout, the third wave may not be as intense, or maybe at least some of the states where vaccine rollout has happened successfully, they won't suffer as much. As for the general distrust in hospitals and such, maybe there would be measures for, I would say, transparency to some extent. But
And just to touch back on my previous question, who do you think the Modi government has been scapegoating for the second wave?
I think it's not like they are scapegoating a particular party, like you are responsible for spreading the so and so way, but it's more like they are scapegoating them that despite the government trying their best, other parties are blaming them when they couldn't do so and so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if somebody actually questions something about the economy or something, they resort to ad hominem attacks about the person questioning rather than actually answering the question or addressing the issue. So I think it's more
Shifting the responsibility.
like you know diverting the attention of people rather than shifting the responsibility.
Mm. Okay. And last question. There was discussion a few years ago that India would be one of the rising powers, cultural powers, economic powers in this century, just because of the population and because of its rising GDP. So there was a lot of talk about India becoming one of the pillars of Asia. Do you think the coronavirus has set that back? And if so, um, how many years do you think it has set it back?
I remember that meme Superpower 2020.
Oh, that was that was everywhere. I don't know who started it. Was it? Did an Indian person actually say that? Because I never really saw an Indian person say that. But from like 2016 to 2019, that was everywhere.
I think it's like some ultra nationalistic person probably made a claim somewhere that India would be a superpower by 2020, and some people picked up on it and used the used these words to mock India.
Hmm.
And what happened was, even the Indians started to use this superpower 2020 thing to mock the government and all the weird things happening in the country. So
Uh-huh.
whenever there was something like a very ridiculous news article,
Hmm.
something which is so ridiculous you wouldn't expect it to be real. Indians
Hmm.
themselves used to repost that with the caption "Superpower 2020."
I'm so upset that meme has died. That was just ridiculous.
So as for India becoming a superpower or a leading power in Asia, maybe it has been set back. And to be honest, it's very hard to say if that will actually happen because India is basically a continent-sized country.
Hmm. It
So
is humongous.
we call Europe a continent, but in reality, we only call it a continent because of the cultural differences. It's actually a part of Eurasia. But if we were to apply, the same criteria for Europe to be a continent, India and the neighboring countries altogether are also, an continent. In English, when we use the phrase the subcontinent,
Hmm.
almost always in 90% of the cases, it refers to India and not any other part of the world.
Mm, that is true.
So I think it's actually very hard to say whether this would actually happen. What India needs is, you know, some leader like Ataturk or Lee Kuan Yew. But what
Hmm.
India gets is people who actually, focus on getting the popular opinion and people who actually happen to be very inept at their own domain. For example, if a certain minister has been assigned so and so ministry, they actually wouldn't have any background of it, and even while working in that ministry, they won't know basic things about it.
Mm. That reminds me of this. I think it was Japan. I'm not. I need to double check, but this Japanese minister of um,
He doesn't know how to operate in computer, right?
yeah, and he was in charge of like online defense or something. I don't. It has something to do with electronics. I forgot the industry in particular, but he admitted that he had no idea how to use the computer, which was just absurd. And it was actually as absurd as recently. By recently, I would say within the 5 years. I think who was it? I think it was a politician called Tony Abbott. Don't quote me, but this pretty powerful politician in Australia. He was actually prime minister for a little bit, who was appointed the minister of women, and he was a male. And there was a lot of jokes that he could get appointed to that position. But I have to double check that. So don't quote me on that just yet.
I think it's probably not just India. It's like a global trend. You
Mm.
know, I was watching a video. It was something like, why do so many Fortune 500 CEOs have an engineering background? So basically, the video explained what the author thought or what the uploader thought were his reasons. Somebody commented, now you should do a follow-up video called "Why are so many politicians uneducated?" And and uh, since I'm from India, India comes to mind, but I think to the most extent, it's actually true for most of the world. Actually, there are very
Mm.
few countries which actually have politicians who are educated and who actually are pragmatic enough to be in the positions even if they don't have the necessary qualifications.
I would agree with that. And this video or this article that I read recently said part of the reason that we think the politicians in the current day are worse or are getting worse. Partly it's nostalgia. We always look back, to the past, and we only remember like the really good ones or the really bad ones. So I would say it's partly nostalgia, but more than that, the article, the video argued that a lot of the power has shifted from the political sphere to the economic sphere. So that's why a lot of the intelligent, capable, pragmatic people are actually choosing to enter economics, and they'd rather be a CEO than a politician.
Personally, I think there's some truth to it because if you are something like a very powerful CEO or businessman, you can actually you don't need to be a politician because you can actually buy politicians. You can basically influence them. You can pay for the rallies, and
Hmm.
they would
Hmm.
make laws that would support you. You
Yeah,
know,
exactly. If I was a dictator and I was trying to take over the world, which I'm not, but if I was that, I would rather be a business person, a CEO, because then I could just buy a politician to do my bidding. That seems more more favorable than being the politician and being subject to scrutiny and criticism. I think working behind the shadows and getting someone else to do it for you is probably more effective.
right? I think we have a lot of examples like that in Asian countries, especially if you look at South Korea. They have jabols, uh, which are like a relic from Japanese zaibatsu.
What?
So,
Sorry. What did you say? In South Korea, they have. Could you repeat that again? In South Korea, they have something.
jabol,
Oh,
Chaebol.
okay. I've heard of Zaibatsu, which is basically big industry working with government, but I've never heard of that word you just said. So could you explain it for me?
Okay, so basically the Chinese characters are the same. The kanji for zaibatsu, it becomes the hanja for jabol in Korean.
Mm-hmm.
So Japan no longer has zaibatsu. Now it has something called keiretsu, but like it's a similar but a differently managed structure.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole issue with or rather the defining feature of chabols is that there are very large organizations like Samsung or
Mm-hmm.
Hyundai.
Mm-hmm.
They have many other organizations under them, and basically they operate as companies. And the succession of power is actually not on basis of meritocracy or hierarchy, but rather on the basis of which family founded them or
Mm, yeah.
in the case of Samsung, the CEO of Samsung, he was said to be in hospital for so many years, and when this coronavirus pandemic happened, they actually announced that he died. So there's like a conspiracy theory which says that the Korean government were hesitant to declare his death because if they declared his death, his successor would have to pay inheritance tax, and that would bring down the whole country's GDP by something like 2 to 4%.
I've actually heard that, and it is insane. That's the fact that that's true. There was discussion that they were trying to hide whether he was alive or not, and it was a top secret whether the founder or the owner, the CEO, was alive or not. But I'm surprised they announced it. Why would they announce it?
It's just my personal theory, but I think it's probably because when the pandemic hit, a lot of countries' GDPs were affected. So
Mm,
if they had to make that announcement, and if that would actually bring down the GDP, they wouldn't suspect or be able to trace it back to this particular event.
got it.
R-
No,
rather,
that makes sense.
rather, the pandemic would be the scapegoat instead.
That makes sense because if the whole point is to avoid a sudden dip in the economy that can be easily traced back to this person, then it makes sense that this was pre-planned because it's not like the person planned to die during the COVID period. No one, no one plans that to happen in advance. But that's interesting. Any last words you want to say about I guess just to me or to our audience about the situation in India and any hopes, any interesting points?
Um, to be honest, I'm not sure what to say about the situation. As for last words, maybe uh, Thanks for listening to Safety Last.
Hmm. Appreciate that, and this isn't an easy topic, and I really appreciate you coming on and speaking to me because otherwise we just wouldn't get the same first-hand experience. A lot of what you hear from the news, I'm not saying that's wrong, but it lacks the personal touch which a podcast or a long form interview can give. And whether it's talking about what you went through, or the government, or the faith or loss of faith in the medical institutions, you've been, very articulate, and it's been very, very insightful. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll talk in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you for tuning in to Safety Last with Stanley Ching. If you enjoyed this, then please leave a rating or a comment. I hope you're leaving with a new idea, and make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and other places that can be found in the description.